There seemed to be a lull in the sightings of UFOs between the end of the First World War and the conclusion of World War II. The years during the Second World War were interesting in that even the smallest of towns had a local sky scanning group called the Ground Observation Corps. These volunteers were trained to man lookout points, many in shacks built on roofs of high buildings, looking for enemy aircraft. It's interesting to note that in the building where I worked in radio for 10 years in Indiana, there were still remnants of the Ground Observation Corps shack on the roof of the bank building that housed the radio studios. We used to joke about the number of nights that many volunteers, often freezing in the Indiana winter, looked for enemy aircraft that would have had to have eluded the personnel on the ground for 2,000 miles, coming in from the Pacific to the Wabash River. But because these volunteers were trained in scanning the night sky, and so few reported anything out of the ordinary, one pundit said that during the Second World War, the aliens got out of the way to see if we would destroy our own planet. Shades of the day the Earth stood still. Finally, the war ended, and in 1947, things began to heat up. The big story in space was Chuck Yeager's breaking of the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 on October 14 of that year. But during the months before, all over the world, people started seeing strange lights in the sky and reported them to local authorities. Now, I was born in 1947, and I've always hoped that the possible arrival of aliens on the planet that year had nothing to do with my birth. But because I grew up in Indiana, and because of the influence of a very important UFO researcher, I soon began to show a keen interest in unexplained phenomena, even as a young child. Indiana, you see, was a hotbed of UFO sightings. During the late 1940s, it held the record for per capita sightings and reports of unidentified things in the air. This is even more interesting when you consider that Indiana was not home to a lot of major Air Force bases or airplane construction factories or major power plants. These, of course, are often thought of as being targets for UFO visits. And the other element that caused me to start thinking about UFOs as a child was the presence on Indianapolis television of a man who many consider to have been the godfather of UFO researchers, or ufologists, if you will. He was broadcaster Frank Edwards. Frank Edwards was a gruff, matter-of-fact commentator. He had a commanding voice. Even though he was seen nightly on television, many would say he had a face for radio. Nearly every evening, Edwards reported some type of paranormal or UFO-related story. At the same time, he was a national radio commentator on the old Mutual Broadcasting System. He also conducted many pioneering radio interviews with people who reportedly saw UFOs. Many of those old recordings are still available. Frank Edwards' love of the paranormal extended beyond the sky. When a young boy disappeared in central Indiana, Edwards took a film crew to an isolated farm in West Virginia where it was said that a farmer had a horse that could talk by nudging spelling blocks suspended on a wire. And more importantly, the horse could tell the future. With sound cameras running, Frank Edwards asked the horse why he had come to West Virginia. The horse spelled out B-O-Y. What about the boy? Edwards asked. The horse spelled out D-E-D. Where will they find him? He continued. The horse spelled out the word tree. The boy's body was eventually found buried at the base of a famous tree in Indiana. Frank Edwards' reporting was pretty heavy, somewhat scary stuff for me, an impressionable young boy watching him on early television. But as I look back on my childhood and my love of the unexplained, I know I will always hold dear his broadcasts, and especially the day I met Frank Edwards. He was in my small hometown at a book signing. I didn't have the money to buy his latest book, Stranger Than Fiction, but I got in line anyway. When I reached the front, I sheepishly told Edwards that I was a big fan, but that I didn't have the money to buy his book. I handed him my 5th grade reader. He signed it. At the end of the year, I wouldn't let my parents sell it, and I still have it. As I was turning to leave, Edwards asked me, "Son, do you know what you want to do when you grow up?" I didn't hesitate. "I want to be on radio, on a network, like you," I answered. "Very good," he told me. "Study hard, and someday I will see you there." Now let's move forward 20 years. I had moved to Washington, D.C., where I had taken a job helping the first producers of The Larry King Show. Now this was when the show was only on radio, and few knew who he was, but his reputation was beginning to grow. I was told to report to the 12th floor of the building housing the mutual offices and check in for my first day of work. As I got off the elevator, I noticed that at the lobby of the network, the walls were covered with blow-up photos of current and former mutual commentators. I went to the reception desk and identified myself. As I looked up, I realized that smack dab in the middle of the wall behind the receptionist was a huge photo of Frank Edwards, looking right into my eyes. I had kept my promise to study hard and try to make something of myself. And what he said was right. He would see me at the network. I get goosebumps today just thinking about it. We've got a lot to cover, so let's move on. Shortly after I was graduated from high school, I took a job at a radio station in the same city where I had gone to junior college. Many nights I worked until midnight. I found myself driving through the Indiana river bottoms, dodging the patchy fog that often gathered there, especially in the spring and fall. One hot night, I thought I saw something odd in the sky. I stopped my car near a river bridge and for 10 minutes watched an odd-colored white, blue, yellow light darting back and forth across the sky. Suddenly it sped upward and was gone. The next day I mentioned my sighting to a friend in school. He told me that a new group had formed in that city. It was a local unit of the national group MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and they were having a meeting that night. I went to the meeting and told my story. I would later find out that several other people had seen the same thing. At the meeting, I met an energetic high school student, the youngest member of the group. Today, more than 40 years later, Carrie Dean and I are best of friends. Over the years, I've worked with MUFON and Carrie and joined him on the board of the National Weather Association. For most of his career, Carrie was an award-winning local TV weather forecaster in Indiana. He helped me immensely in sorting out many stories I've reported on UFOs during the year and helped research this presentation. As a newsperson and newscaster over the years, the vast majority of stories on UFO sightings that came across my desk came off the wires after I reached the network level, working first for Mutual and later for 20 years for the old UPI radio network in Washington, L.A., and Las Vegas. Now, you have to understand that during my 10 or so years in local radio, I saw only occasional reports on the unexplained. You see, national editors only funnel down the news they think is the most interesting or have time for. But at Mutual and UPI, I was at the big national headquarters. I saw everything that came in from around the world. I can safely say that seldom did a day go past when somewhere in the world someone hadn't seen something unidentified in the skies.